Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel coming in today. If you look at what has changed over the last 50 years, is it fair to say that as we look at the global marketplace, we compete with China, India, Mexico, Vietnam, Brazil, Canada at a far greater rate today than we even did 10 years ago, far more than 40 years ago. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And
would you all say that capital is pretty free-flowing? It goes to the best home possible?
Right.
Where it's, right? I mean, it's kind of like as we look at our own spending habits, Walmart has become successful because people want their dollar to go as far as possible, right? And they go to Walmart instead of maybe another store that doesn't provide the best value. And is capital kind of the same way? It goes to the best place? Am I right on that? Yeah, you're shaking your heads, yes. And so if we look at raising taxes in America, doesn't that make us less competitive on this global stage? I mean, isn't it not as good of a home for capital as some of the other OECD countries that were put up in the chart?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess I don't know if you guys look at Switzerland, Ireland, Germany, Canada, Chile. Are those countries, Mr. Stone, is there a movement within those countries to create economic growth by raising their tax rates right now?
There's not, although right now their short-term economic problems are so great that the question of attracting investment is less important to them than getting their budgets in order and worrying about high unemployment. On the question of capital mobility, yes, capital is mobile, and yes, we're competing with more people, but there's an awful lot of considerations that go into whether it's worthwhile to be producing in, you mentioned Vietnam versus producing in Pennsylvania or in Texas, and there's a lot more considerations, and the United States still enjoys many advantages of producing right here in the United States. Capital's not flying all the way out, and capital's not quite as mobile as we all nodded our heads to. There's some limitations.
And maybe you hear things different than I do, but when I'm talking to business leaders, they'll tell me it's not the only consideration. They look at the American workforce, its productivity, its intelligence, but they also look at the tax code. Do they tell you something different than what they're telling me?
I'm saying all these things figure in. Not
right, and so isn't it fair to say if you guys are advocating raising taxes, aren't you too advocating for a less competitive American economy?
So I think we need to balance the fiscal priorities. So I mean, you mentioned that one of the factors in our competitiveness is our workforce, and certainly other factors are our infrastructure and the strength of the consumer base in the United States. And so I mean, I think we need to balance the concern about statutory rates with the need to fund the things the investments that are going to maintain our competitiveness. In particular, if we think about workforce, education, investing in our infrastructure, and I think those things are indispensable to long-term economic growth and competitiveness.
And I might not have the right number of this. We're sitting at about a $98 trillion non-funded liabilities. Is that roughly the right number? Anyone? That's the number I've heard. I mean,
we have large deficits in the future. If that's what. Yeah.
Do you think we can tax our way out of these unfunded liabilities, or at some point do we have to say what promises have we made? You look at the expansive growth of government. At some point, instead of going, we have to tax more to meet the obligations, shouldn't we at some point say, we have too many obligations. We have to cut back. We have to scale back instead of adding, more onto the unfunded liabilities this country has, Mr. Stone?
Our long-term budget deficit problem, unfunded liabilities is one measure. It's a little bit of a shaky measure, but there's no question that we have big budget deficits in the future. It's almost exclusively driven by rising healthcare costs that are rising faster than other costs in the economy, faster than GDP, and that's happening not just in the government programs, but it's happening in the private programs as well. If we find a way to get a handle on those costs, our budget deficit problem down the road becomes much more manageable. It's not about Social Security being out of control. It's not about discretionary spending being out of control. It's healthcare costs.
And let me, one quick question before I have to turn it over. Am I correct that there's not a historic correlation between tax rates and revenue as a percentage of GDP? The actual correlation of revenue to the federal coffers will actually correlate with GDP growth. So the basic point is if you grow your economy, so too do you grow revenues to the federal coffers, as opposed to raising taxes doesn't necessarily bring in the growth that would be projected. Anyway,
Well, we did in the 1990s have a very strong economy, raised a lot of revenue, brought the budget deficit down, produced surpluses, and then we gave it away.
And my time is up, and hopefully we'll have a second round, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Duffy. I would point out